My number 8 best chess game of the 1980s is Ilya Smirin vs. Alexander Beliavsky. These two grandmasters are both known for their uncompromising attacking styles of play, and sometimes when two such players meet, the victor is simply the one who refuses to flinch. In this game, we see Beliavsky play a masterpiece in which he builds up a great attack and finishes with a perfect king hunt. Smirin has the white pieces, Beliavsky the black, and Smirin selects an open game with pawn to e4 and follows up with bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game, of course, one of the most classic options available to white. Now, this is highly theoretical, of course, and in this game, both players will be following theory through about move 18. I think the next interesting decision comes on move 9 from Beliavsky, who after pawn to h3 selects knight to b8, the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez. This is one of the sharper options available to black, so it definitely suits Beliavsky's style. Beginning and intermediate players may very justifiably ask, why would you pull the knight back to its starting square so early in the game? The answer is in the deployment of this bishop. White's last move, pawn to h3, took away the g4 square from that bishop, so that bishop is now thinking to go to b7. However, it doesn't want to be blocked by a knight on c6. So the knight wants to get out of the way. And it wants to get out of the way right away so it can go to d7 and support this pawn on e5 after white's next move, pawn to d4. Immediately then, knight to d7, the knight has completed its maneuver to get out of the way of the bishop and support the pawn on e5, perfectly timing everything. So after knight d7, we see knight to d2, and it might look like these knight maneuvers are identical. Knight d7, knight d2, both moves have the same purpose, right? Actually, no. Black's move is to support the pawn on e5, and the knight's going to stay here for the foreseeable future to support that pawn. White's knight is on the beginning of a journey. It's going on to f1, on to g3, or e3. This is the Spanish knight maneuver. It is a classic maneuver, and if you're not familiar with it, you definitely want to stick it in your head and use it in future games. Once it completes this maneuver, it might continue on to f5 if allowed. So bishop b7 now, bishop c2, rook to e8, knight to f1, continuing the maneuver, bishop back to f8, a very nice placement for the bishop, which is headed on to g7 after knight f5 and g6. Black has perfectly set up everything, so the whole system kind of fits together like clockwork. The rook has both moved to e8 to support this pawn on e5 and to clear the way for the bishop to go to f8. The bishop is heading back to f8 and then on to g7, which unblocks the rook and finds a good post for that bishop while restricting the knight on f5. Of course, this kind of system where every piece finds its perfect placement took years to develop, centuries to develop. After pawn g6, we see bishop g5, h6, bishop d2, bishop g7, queen c1 tickling this pawn over here, and king h7, a classic maneuver to support this extended pawn on h6 after you fianchetto. In this position, Smirin is looking for a way to continue because he senses that his minor pieces are optimally placed and he can't really improve in the center or with his major pieces. So he expands with his pawns, pawn to h4, initiating kingside play. This is a perfect moment to pause your video and try to figure out how Beliavsky responded to this kingside aggression. As chess players, we are taught from an early age to meet wing play with a strike in the middle of the board. In this position, Beliavsky senses the opportunity to do just that, and he pushes forward with the instructive pawn to d5. This creates the maximum possible tension between the pawns in the center of the board that is inevitably going to lead to an opening of lines. Beliavsky is hoping that that will favor his minor pieces, especially his bishops, and he is also trying to show that this move pawn to h4 is a waste of time, irrelevant in the coming positions. Now here we get a capture on d5, a capture on d4, and in this position, Smirin makes a mistake. He flinches. He's been playing aggressively, but Beliavsky has not backed down. Still, it is correct to continue aggressively in this position with pawn to h5. This creates a messy position in which both sides have their chances. Instead, he plays knight takes d4. He's probably hoping that Beliavsky will play knight takes d5 when he has a great shot. There's rook takes e8, queen takes e8, and then knight d to f5. A beautiful knight sacrifice. After the capture here, knight takes f5 threatens all kinds of discoveries, so you want to move the king out of the way of these discoveries, but then you can trade on g7, pick off h6, and in this position you have the important move bishop to g7 check, sacrificing the bishop just to bring your queen in a little bit faster. King takes g7, queen g5, and in this position there is no way for black to avoid a sequence of checks that is going to push his king to the e file, where he is going to get skewered by rook to e1 and he's going to lose his queen. Here is the full sequence leading to the loss of the queen for black. Rook e1, and boom, the queen falls. The game is busted for black. Instead though, after knight takes d4, Beliavsky plays the excellent move knight to e5. This keeps more pieces on the board, and it intends to capture on d5 with the queen instead of the knight, which is going to be much stronger, and at that point almost all of Beliavsky's pieces will be participating in the coming attack. Still, Smirin is resourceful, and here he plays knight to e6, a very aesthetic move. The point is that if you capture the knight here with the pawn, then white can play rook takes e5, and in this position white is actually much better because black's structure has been ruined. So after knight to e6, the knight is simply ignored, queen takes d5. Now this is threatening mate down here on g2, and of course the knight is still hanging, so the only move for white is knight back to f4, threatening the queen and defending g2. The queen simply pulls back to c6, maintaining her strong position on this diagonal, and Smirin continues with pawn to h5, following through a little bit too late on his advance with the h-pawn. Once again, pause your video and try to figure out how Beliavsky met, again, this h-pawn push. For the second time, the answer is not to flinch in the face of Smirin's aggression. You should play the principled move rook a to d8, which Beliavsky does play here. This move brings a second rook to an open central file. In this position, Beliavsky also has the bishops on the best possible long diagonals on the board, and his queen is also participating in a battery against g2. How could good things not come to pass from such a position? After rook a d8, Smirin does trade here on g6, and in this position, he plays queen to b1. This move reminds me a lot of the game Letelier vs Fischer, another amazing game. I'll link to a video in the pop-up here. In that game as well, Letelier slid his queen over to b1 to create some relatively small threats, and he was promptly punished. The same thing is going to happen here. After queen b1, we see rook takes d2, picking off this loose bishop, and Smirin follows through with his idea. He picks up g6, and then he picks up e8. In this position, he is picking up a rook and a pawn for two minor pieces. Not generally a trade you want to make, and in this position it proves to be particularly bad. After knight takes e8, there is one last resource available to Smirin. He should activate his queen, queen to f5. After that, there is a strong position for black with knight d6, queen e6 check, and then you block that, and everything is defended. However, in this position, Smirin is able to trade queens on c6, and although he will suffer, it is not clear that he will lose this game. However, he slid his queen along the bottom rank one time too many here with queen to c1. This move loses spectacularly by force. Pause your video and try to see if you can find the great combination that Beliavsky played here. There are some times in a great chess player's life when they just know that a move they're about to play is going to be immortal. I have to think that Beliavsky felt that about his next move, the brilliant rook takes f2. This stunning move, a rook sacrifice, leads directly to a decisive king hunt. I also have to imagine that this move shocked Smirin. He is a great player and he can absolutely find a move like this, but if he had seen this coming, I don't see how he could have played into it. After rook takes f2, you must accept the sacrificed rook, as otherwise the loss of this pawn and the pressure on g2 is overwhelming, so king takes f2. You also have to have seen the follow-up, knight to d3 check. You must sacrifice the knight as well. Now this knight jump forks everything. It is a royal fork, and then some, also hitting e1 and f4. After the forced knight takes d3, finally, black crashes through on g2, queen takes g2 check, and king to e3. Now, anytime you can find a forcing sequence that pushes your opponent's king in front of all of the defending pieces, you should feel optimistic. These kinds of king hunts are usually lethal. However, you must calculate accurately. Just because the king has been pushed out doesn't mean you can freely sacrifice a rook and a knight and hope that things work out. You are short on forces to follow up. In this position, there is only one decisive move. Beliavsky surely had to have seen it coming. Can you pause your video and find the winning move in this position? Incorrect is the very tempting queen takes g3 check, picking up a full knight for free with check. But after queen takes g3, the king can fall back to safety with king to d2. In this position, you have no follow-up and you're still down 2 exchanges, so white should win the game. Instead, Beliavsky found the excellent and principled knight to d6. He remembers once again to include all of his pieces in the attack, and he threatens knight c4 check, king f4, and queen f3 mate. There are a few ideas for white to try to fend off this mate, but none will save the game. One is pawn to b3, taking away that c4 square, but the knight finds a new way to deliver a critical blow after queen takes g3, king d2, queen g2 check, rook e2, and now knight e4 check. After a few more checks, the knight is able to give a fork here with knight takes c3 hitting the king and the rook falls, and black wins the game. Another idea after knight d6 is queen to d1, trying to cover f3 with the queen. This might be the most resilient move, but after bishop f6 intending bishop g5, there's no way for white to save the game. Played in the game was rook f1, choosing to defend the f3 mate with the rook instead. In this position, we see knight c4 check, pushing the king up to f4, and here the strongest is probably pawn to h5. Instead, queen d5, threatening queen g5 mate was played. This is certainly good enough to win the game. It doesn't spoil anything, but if knight f5 here, the only really clean way to finish the game off is actually to go back to g2 and after knight g3 to play h5 in this position. After queen d5 in the game, knight f5 was not played. Instead, the king tried to run for it with king g4, but he's not able to get away. Bishop back to c8 check. Here, if you see knight f5 blocking the diagonal here from the bishop, then queen takes d3 is strong. There are many threats, including knight e5 and knight e3, and black is winning comfortably. After bishop c8 check, the king slid over to h4, king h4, and now queen d8 check. The queen delivers a very strong check back on her starting square. King h5, queen d8 check, king h4, queen to e7 check, king h5, and after this little staircase maneuver by the queen, knight to e3. This move blocks the queen's protection of g5. The threat is queen g5 mate, and as straightforward as the mate threat is, it's still pretty much unstoppable. There's no sensible way for Smirin to try to respond to that mate threat, so it is in this position that he resigned the game. This is a beautiful final position and a beautiful game from Beliavsky, probably his finest of many fine wins. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more of my favorite games from the 1980s, simply click on the playlist that is sitting right on top of the board.